using the power of the freezing cold to fight against strikers. You know, Mr. Freeze stuff, but without the relatable backstory about loving his wife. They also forced salaried workers to become scabs and take over the factory floor work, despite these salaried workers being woefully untrained and unprepared to, work in a factory. Almost immediately after John Deere forced their workers to go on the factory floor, someone crashed a tractor into an electrical box. Oops! I guess the unskilled, replaceable work of operating 10,000-pound machines requires some, skill. While this incident is admittedly pretty funny, what's not funny is that John Deere cares so little about its salaried employees that they're willing to risk the lives of office workers by thrusting them into an environment they haven't trained for. And they care so little about their factory workers that in all the years they've been running the company, they haven't bothered to learn how difficult their job is. Feels like the embodiment of Michael Scott, like there has to be an Office episode about this. Anyway, the John Deere strike ended only after the company relented and gave workers a 10% pay raise. But this was far from the only strike that struck even before Striketober began. In Striketember, Nabisco employees went on strike for an attempt by the company to implement a similar two-tier wage system. The strike only ended when the union was able to demand increased wages and killed said payment system. Then there's the Kellogg strike in Omaha, in which workers, also like the John Deere strikers, are against a two-tier system where Kellogg's is able to pay those they deem transitional employees less for the same amount of work as legacy employees. Kellogg's was also trying to increase the number of employees they get to classify as transitional employees, so, trying to pay more employees less. The strike was also over poor working conditions, where they are forced to work 12 to 16-hour days, given mandatory overtime, and were punished for taking sick days. If there's one thing we've learned during the pandemic, it's that forcing people to work when they're sick is smart and good, and smart again and good again. The strike ended after the union voted to accept a new work contract that offered higher wages and more benefits. Unions, they're cereal pushers! Speaking of gross food we love, in October, McDonald's workers walked off the job in 12 different cities over the company inadequately protecting workers from sexual, verbal, and physical harassment in the workplace. Also, 60,000 members of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees threatened to strike, citing grueling working conditions over 12-hour workdays with little to no breaks and low pay. IATSE president Matthew Loeb said, "Our people have basic human needs like time for meal breaks, adequate sleep, and a weekend. For those at the bottom of the pay scale, they deserve nothing less than a living wage." Sleep! Meal breaks! What's next? Not having your every move monitored while having to skip bathroom breaks to keep your job, also known as being an Amazon employee. How incredibly shocking that while we were writing this episode, Amazon experienced a bunch of walkouts from employees demanding a higher wage and longer breaks. Did I say we wrote this episode? No. This is spontaneous. It's rebel radio, hard Harry, etc., and so forth. Anywho, in related news that I'm spontaneously mentioning, 30,000 Kaiser Permanente employees threatened to strike in November, also citing a two-tiered system in which newer hires would be given up to a 39% pay cut for the same work as other employees, despite the company making $10 billion during the pandemic and its CEO getting a $35 million retirement package. Hey, do you notice a trend in these strikes? One of their primary complaints has been unequal pay for newer hires, which creates a system of arbitrary inequity among the workforce. The workers striking may not even be the ones getting the pay cut, but still go on strike in solidarity. Unions recognize that when companies do this, they splinter workers into smaller groups, causing rifts and making it harder to organize. In this case, it was more like Kaiser not permanent. Kaiser permanent, not permanent. Because the company caved, is the point, agreeing to do away with the two-tier payment system and increasing wages. Shane Burley, the communications organizer of the Oregon Federation of Nurses and Health Professionals, said, "I'm really happy we have an agreement. It was a really long fight. It only happened because we basically put forth the largest healthcare strike in American history." In fact, around half of the 140,000 people who went on strike in 2021 were healthcare workers. Or, the heroes on the front line of the pandemic that we made cute Funko Pops out of, and some weird political cartoons imagining them getting killed in a war before forgetting to do anything materially useful for them at all, or like even viewing them as people with lives who were just doing a job that wasn't supposed to have casualties. Like, imagine if a serial killer was slaughtering a bunch of accountants, and instead of doing anything, we just called them brave soldiers and thanked them for their sacrifice. That would be weird and up. And so in 2021, nurses went on strike for 10 months in Massachusetts at St. Vincent Hospital. The hospital is owned by Tenet, a very serious action adventure through time and space that I have not gotten around to seeing yet, and a for-profit healthcare company that owns 60 hospitals in the US and is valued at over $8 billion. The nurses union had been negotiating with hospital management for 2 years for a better contract, asking for pay increases and safer working conditions, but mainly for the hospital to address its staffing issues. More specifically, that there was not enough staff per patient. The strikers called out a policy of the hospital to send nurses home during a shift if the management thought they were not needed, a practice called flexing. But despite how it sounds, this was done out of cost cutting and not overstaffing, meaning that the remaining nurses on duty became swamped. And amazingly, this happened even during the pandemic.
To maximize profits, American hospitals have been intentionally understaffing nurses for decades, long before the pandemic. What the hospital industry doesn't want you to know is that there's never been more licensed nurses in America. Hospitals just aren't hiring them.
After the 300-day strike of 700 workers, the nurses union won. They not only beat the hospital management's attempt to replace them with strikebreakers, they also got their main demands over staffing issues, 2% pay raises, better healthcare since nurses need healthcare too, and provisions for nurses who are assaulted on the job, which is sadly a thing that happens a lot. This is also an improvement for patients. Research has shown, unsurprisingly, that patient outcomes improve when they get more individual time with nurses. But despite what seems like a win for both the nurses and the patients, amazingly, there was an attempt to kill the nurses union following their victory. The National Right to Work Defense Fund, an anti-union organization, has given money to aid in a union decertification effort, led by a strike-breaking nurse who quite ironically said the union was dividing workers. Some fun facts about the National Right to Work Defense Fund. It was established in 1968 and tries to advance right-to-work laws that prohibit unions from having agreements with management that all employees must pay dues. Also, it was started by a white supremacist. Because this is America, you see. And so the anti-union right-to-work movement started with the Christian American Association, led by Republican businessman Vance Muse. Just to give you an idea of who Vance Muse was, his own son described him as a white supremacist, an anti-Semite, and a communist baiter, a man who beat on labor unions not on behalf of working people, as he said, but because he was paid to do so. Vance Muse also fought women's suffrage, tried to bring back child labor, and published anti-Semitic and anti-black propaganda. In other words, the founder of the right to work is a man perpetually on the wrong side of history who was probably paid to do it. And this is the same movement alive and kicking today, and trying to kill unions even after successful strikes that improve conditions for workers and patients. Luckily, the St. Vincent's Nurses Union voted to keep their union, so that's good. In fact, the pushback against anti-union propaganda and toxic work culture in general seems to be growing. Posts from the anti-work subreddit have reached immense popularity and media pearl clutching. The anti-work subreddit has 1.8 million members since starting out as a niche community for work abolition, ending forced labor through capitalism. They cite books like The Abolition of Work by Bob Black. But for most of the users, it's a place to vent about their struggles and mistreatment at work, as well as a place for cathartic, if not sometimes fake, posts about texts they send their bosses quitting jobs that treat them poorly. It rose to prominence during the pandemic alongside the great resignation of people quitting in record numbers. And again, whether or not these posts of people telling off their workplaces are real or not, this subreddit really rose to fame as some hardcore comeuppance porn, like really raw dogging that comeuppance. Their popularity reveals how many people fantasize about quitting their job after a round of abuse from their boss. And most importantly, people realizing they have the chance to actually demand better treatment and have leverage, as in realizing the value of their labor and the fact that they aren't as replaceable as they've been told. And that, of course, brings us to me, and why I'm on strike, and my own realization. Sorry, ads? Really? What? This is my pirate broadcast! How could there be ads? Who even are you? What is... It's been just you this whole time? Okay, well, I guess we have to cut to ads now, Mom. Fight the power, but I guess also enjoy these sponsors. Why hello there! Do you have a small business? Perhaps you're trying to heroically save money by removing your employees' personal bathrooms. Time, as you know, is money and nothing else. So why not save time and therefore money by using Stamps.com? They're great for small business owners or anyone with that side hustle.